Dirty Moderates, many of you know that politics and political data and everything that comes with it, I kind of take a view that it's kind of like my Super Bowl. Political geeks like me cherish this, and especially an election year coming up, probably the biggest we've ever had. And here to pour over some of or much of what we're looking at in this crazy bonkers political time is Kyle Kondik. Kyle is the managing editor for Sabato's Crystal Ball, which is at the University of Virginia's Center for Politics. Kyle, welcome to Dirty Moderate.
Thanks for having me.
I wanted to start with a piece that Tom Etzel wrote in the Times yesterday. I think it'll be a good portal for us to dive into the sort of Biden troubles, if you will, and we'll go from there. This essay yesterday, which he always amalgamates a lot of different people's data and opinions. It's called "This Is Grim," and this is what Etzel writes: "The predictive power of horse race polling a year from the presidential election is weak at best. The Biden campaign can take some comfort in that. But what recent surveys do reveal is that the coalition that put Joe Biden in the White House in the first place is nowhere near as strong as it was 4 years ago. These danger signs include fraying support among core constituencies, including young voters, Black voters, and Hispanic voters, and the decline, if not the erasure, of traditional Democratic advantages in representing the interests of the middle class and speaking for the average voter. Any of these on their own might not be cause for alarm," Etzel continues, "but taken together, they present a dangerous situation for Biden. From November 5th through November 11th, Democracy Corps, a Democratic advisory group founded by Stan Greenberg and James Carville, surveyed 2,500 voters in presidential and Senate battleground states, as well as competitive House districts. And in an email, Greenberg summarized the results, quote unquote, 'This is grim.' The study," he said, "found that collectively voters in the Democratic base of Blacks, Hispanics, Asians, LGBTQ plus community, Gen Z millennials, unmarried, and college women give Trump higher approval ratings than Biden." Obviously, we've been seeing a number of polls that have showed a lot of weakness in the Biden re-election campaign, and not just national polls, because I always tell people the election is going to be 1 in 6 states roughly, so forget national polls. What do you make of what Etzel is saying here, and what are you looking at numbers wise that compares or contrasts to it?
I mean, look, the polling data for Biden over maybe particularly the last month and a half has really been poor. And, I guess the big headliner was the New York Times Siena College polls, and those, just the imprimatur of the Times, and the fact that I do think they put a lot of, money and resources and time into these polls. And, the New York Times is so well read by particularly people on the left that, Biden was doing really pretty poorly. And I think it was 6 swing states they polled. Biden was only leading in one of them, Wisconsin, and it was only by a small margin. And so that got a lot of attention. And within the sort of guts of the polls, the crosstabs, what Edsel is referring to, you do see some of the weaknesses, amongst young voters, amongst non-white voters, sort of the core Democratic constituencies. And so there's been a lot of back and forth about how meaningful this is. Of course, as Edsel notes, and as studies have shown that polling this far out is not necessarily predictive. On the other hand, in 2020, late 2019, the New York Times did some state level polls that actually ended up being probably better than the stuff they put out right before the election. Now, part of it was that COVID kind of messed everything up, and it was sort of this roller coaster ride where Biden's lead seemed a lot bigger at times than it actually ended up being. And you could say, hey, Biden and Trump are both sort of known commodities. It's not like the Republican challenger is some unknown person or someone who still has to introduce themselves to the national audience. So I do think there are a lot of Democrats and people who are rooting for the Democrats, I guess, who are concerned, and that seems reasonable to be that way if you're worried about the president, whose approval rating has been pretty weak for much of his presidency, although that's certainly no different than Donald Trump throughout Trump's presidency. Now, I do think that some of this is a little overstated. I just don't believe that at the end of the day, 18 to 29-year-olds are going to be competitive, in terms of Trump having a chance to win them. I just don't see that. The past couple of decades, young people have generally moved to being much more Democratic. And I think there's also some polling, or there's some suggestion that polling may be understating the traditional Democratic strength, particularly with Black voters, with non-white voters in general. Now, again, you could believe those things and say these polls might not be reflecting what reality ultimately ends up being. But if there is even some weakness, given how close our elections are, then I think that is cause for concern. So it's like these polls don't have to be perfectly correct for Democrats to still be worried about these core constituencies. I do, one other thing that I do think is important to note here is that, like, there's so much focus on Biden as the incumbent president. Trump has been able to run, frankly, a pretty sleepy primary campaign because he's so far ahead. He hasn't had to go to the debates. He's still, of course, saying outrageous things, but he's not getting the kind of coverage that I think he used to get.
Right.
Also, his legal troubles are going to be more prominent next year because he's actually going to be, he's going to be in court for some of these things, although I guess he has been in court recently. But, there probably will be a time where the focus will move more to him. And my guess is that this is going to be a race, if it is in fact Biden versus Trump, where you're not going to want the spotlight. Usually you think in politics, like, oh, I want to dominate the news. I want people to be thinking about me. When you got two candidates with pretty lousy favorability, you probably want the public to be thinking about the other guy.
Yeah. Well, it's true what you say too is about Trump's legal troubles, because also one of the things that kind of got buried in the reporting on the New York Times poll, the Times Siena poll that everybody freaked out about, or many people freaked out about, was that if Trump is a convicted felon, right, or found guilty in any of these cases, his numbers tank with independents. And at least according to that poll, they're looking at Trump as a indicted but not convicted felon. So I do wonder if those legal troubles, as they mount, clearly there's 91 felony counts. He's going to get convicted for something. I don't think he's going to be in prison, but he may be running as a convicted felon. And that we haven't had before. Eugene Debs ran from jail, obviously, but none of us were alive. But that should be an interesting set of circumstances, don't you think?
Yeah, look, we're in uncharted territory, but so much of what we've dealt with Donald Trump has been kind of uncharted territory. And I don't know what to make of how soon he could be potentially convicted of something, because I always just think of the legal process is just taking a really long time. Yeah. And there's just the ability for the defendant to kind of kick the can down the road in various ways. And I think Trump has some experience doing that, although the charges he's facing now are much more serious than legal issues he's faced in the past, back in his days as a private citizen. So yeah, that's another feature here that, again, I think maybe we're catching, maybe the polls in November were catching Trump at sort of a higher point than he otherwise would be. But he's also polling better than he did in 2016 or 2020 as compared to his, leading Democratic alternative. So there's that. We also know that the Electoral College, at least over the past couple of cycles, has had this kind of Republican lean to it. Yeah. In that, the state that decided the election voted several points to the right of the nation as a whole. So, it may be that Trump doesn't actually need to win. He probably doesn't need to win the popular vote necessarily. And as you mentioned, what are we talking about here? Probably 6-7 states that are really decisive. There were 7 states decided by 3 points or less in the last election. Biden won 6 of those 7. So, Arizona, Nevada, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Georgia, and then North Carolina is the one that Trump won. Those are the states we're probably going to be focusing on this time. If there are other states that emerge, it might be because the election's tilting one way or the other. If we're talking about Minnesota and New Hampshire being competitive as they really were in 2016, not so much in 2020, that's alarm bells for Democrats. If we're talking about like Florida and Texas and North Carolina being competitive, that maybe indicates that things are tilting against the Republicans, come next fall. But we're in a time period of, arguably the most competitive era in American presidential history. The only other time that really compares to it is the late 1800s, which is also a time where you had a couple of what we call electoral college misfires, where the person who got the most votes did not actually win the electoral college in both 1876 and 1888. Same story in 2000 and 2016. But the country, broadly speaking, is not competitive because so many of the states are landslides for one side or the other. One other just quick point about these demographic issues that Biden is having. If in fact Biden is holding up, relatively speaking, better with white voters than he is with non-white voters, the effect that could have is that maybe like a California or New York, has like a slightly reduced Democratic margin, which is actually what you saw in, at least in California, in comparing 2016 to 2020. It's one of the few places where Biden's margin was actually a little bit smaller than Hillary Clinton's, but it didn't matter because the California was super Democratic. And so, maybe Biden holds up better in some of the swing states than he does, relatively speaking, in some of the really red or the really blue states, particularly the blue states that are pretty racially diverse and have these kind of big metro areas with a lot of young people. That's kind of what we saw in the 2022 midterm, in that, it was kind of a red wave in a lot of the kind of, slant states that were like strongly red or strongly blue. But in the most important presidential states, Democrats did quite well. So that's something to think about too, that, part of what happened for Hillary Clinton in 2016 was that she basically traded a lot of useful votes in the swing states for not very useful votes in sort of Republican Sunbelt. Now in 2020, those were useful votes for Biden, and he won some new states for Democrats, and he also won back some states that Hillary Clinton had lost. It is possible that Trump could do a similar thing, in that maybe he loses some useful votes in the swing states, but he picks up ones in states that aren't actually that helpful for him. And maybe that changes how we view the electoral college and how it relates to the national popular vote.
Right. I mean, in your, from 30,000 feet, the narrative continues to be, I actually think there's reason for it, that working class voters, largely men, but not only men, of all colors. The identity politics thing has tripped up the left now. I think it's eating them alive, and it should have never been a gambit. However, working class men, especially Latino men, are trending away from the Democratic Party. Do you see in your data, the data that you've studied across various platforms and the way you do it, are you seeing this working class shift multi-ethnically? Kind of marching in the rightward direction?
There is some evidence for it, and I think we saw that in the 2020 election results. Patrick Ruffini, a Republican pollster, his firm is Echelon Insights. He has a new book out called Party of the People, and of course, he's coming at it from a Republican perspective. But I thought the book was pretty good, and I think is worth reading wherever you sit on the political spectrum. And he goes through some of this stuff and some of the opportunities for Republicans and some of the changing demographics in the parties. And it is kind of odd that, like, so, we think of the Democrats as being the party of the people, to borrow the book title. And particularly if you go back to like the days of the New Deal and Franklin Roosevelt and the sort of integration of the labor movement basically into the Democratic Party, and the Republicans sort of more of like the business class party. And then that's kind of changed over time. And that, the Democrats have added kind of more white collar voters while subtracting blue collar voters. And in some ways you wonder if that eventually may have an effect on like the actual governing philosophies of the parties, because the Democrats are still the let's raise taxes and let's have more social programs and all that stuff. And the Republicans are still a laissez-faire economic party, although some people within the Republican Party now, some of the newer voices, are really not that way, or at least not, at least in terms of how they talk about things. We'll have to see how it figures into a governing philosophy. But like, whatever you think of like Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri or J.D. Vance of Ohio, they don't sound like the people who came before them in those Senate seats, and they're a little bit different than the kind of older school Republican Party. Again, I don't think it's really translated to policy that much, although I think you probably do see it on the foreign policy front, in that some Republicans kind of have been more dovish on foreign policy, basically not wanting to invest American dollars in Ukraine, and certainly not American soldiers, although that's not something that Democrats or even those most supportive of fighting in Ukraine are generally supportive of actually sending boots on the ground there. But so there are some changes going on, but you just wonder if that might, how that might change things. And there are some voices on the Democratic side who are saying, hey, party needs to get back to basics in terms of kind of an economic message, and maybe not not being as vocal about certain hot button social issues. But of course, there are a lot of people in the Democratic Party who push back on that too. So there's a lot of churn going on, I think, in the parties. And some of the things that we sort of associate with the two-party coalitions, maybe they change over time based on the parties that the people that they're bringing in and also kind of pushing out.
Yeah, well, the parties certainly, as we know, in the 60s had a huge shift over race. But, I was thinking about something. I had the pleasure of interning on Capitol Hill 2 summers, once for Bob Graham of Florida, who you may remember, who was also a governor. He was a senator, because I'm originally from Florida, and a congressman named Peter Deutsch. And this is 1994 and 1995. So it's, 30 years ago or so. Bill Clinton's in the White House. One of the things you saw, though you started to see as soon as Gingrich came in, a real fracture, partisan kind of polarization emerging, which I think we're still living with. But the thing that I think gets buried a little bit, and I'm curious of your take on this. There is a partisan divide, but there is a rural-urban divide as it relates to what the Democratic Party, their direction they're going, and the Republicans. And I say this to say that what people who are not old enough to remember, right, is that there were liberal Republicans, there were conservative Democrats. The parties were less polarized because they had pretty strong, even if they were small, factions who were able to be restive and ideologically hybrids that made the parties more responsive in many ways to the center and less polarized. Well, that doesn't get enough attention. Yeah, when you hear, oh, Democrats are the college-educated elite urban party. Well, that's a huge thing, because that means there are a lot less rural Democrats out there connecting to voters in the vast swath of red across the United States.
Yeah, I mean, if you go back to throughout the back half of the 20th century, a lot of the presidential elections were really not competitive at all.
No.
One of them was 1976 between Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford.
Right.
And, Carter was the last Democrat who he won all the states of the old Confederacy, except for Virginia, which interestingly is now the most reliably Democratic states of the 11 states of the old Confederacy. But its realignment toward the Republicans was sort of a little bit different than some of the other states, in part because of growth in Northern Virginia, which was Republican at that time and now is super, cobalt blue Democratic.
Well, they were moderate Republican suburbs, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, and a lot of places like that have kind of realigned more toward the Democrats over time. But in the 1976 election, so Carter won by 2 points nationally. A lot of the individual states were competitive. Yeah. And in that election, I think it was something like 30% of all the House districts voted for one party for president and the other party for their House members. So that's a large amount of crossover. In the 2020 election, under the maps in place in that election, only 16 of the 435 districts were crossover. So whatever percentage that is, like 3, 4, 5% of all the districts. And you see the same thing at the Senate level. You would have, like back then, you would have had a lot of Southern Democrats who were still elected in the Senate, even though those states, other than 76, were starting to vote Republican at the presidential level. Of course, Reagan did quite well in those places. The Bushes did. I mean, that's been a continuing story, but a lot of those Democrats held on until like 2010 or 2014. And now there are only 5 senators out of the 100 who represent states that their party did not win in the 2020 presidential race. Joe Manchin, who's retiring in West Virginia, so that's going to be a Republican Senate seat starting in 2025. And then John Tester of Montana and Sherrod Brown of Ohio, both of whom face tough reelection bids.
Would you think they're
in states that are very likely to vote Republican for president. And then you've got Susan Collins of Maine, who did win in 2020 as a Republican in a Biden state, and Ron Johnson of Wisconsin, who came pretty close to losing in 2022. So that's it. If you go back a generation or two, you would have seen a much longer list of folks like that. So there's been all this sorting that's been going on, and it has made the parties, I think, more ideologically consistent than they used to be. I mean, certainly, like the Democratic House majority of, the most recent one in 2020, in the 2021-2022 Congress, it's only 222 members, but it was much more solidly liberal than that Democratic House majorities of like 2009 and 2010, where you had couple dozen or several dozen more members, but a lot of them were kind of still, rural Southern or Midwestern Democrats who didn't want to vote for like the Affordable Care Act and those sorts of things. So, Pelosi might have
Blanche Lincoln in the Senate and people like that.
Colin Peterson in Minnesota who finally lost in 2020, and he was kind of the last like real outlier because he held a 30-point Trump district. Currently, no one holds a district. I think the highest is maybe 15 or 16 points that voted for the other party in presidential, and yet they hold it. And there are a handful of currently under the present maps. There are only 5 Democrats in Trump won districts, and then there are 18 Republicans in Biden won districts. Actually, 17 because George Santos is one of them, and he is now a former member of Congress. But that is a seat that Republicans are defending on Biden won turf. So again, a much lower number than you would have seen in the past. And so it speaks to the ideological cohesion of the parties. And even in the Republican side, you would have had, just some more kind of like moderate members. I guess they're still around, although I honestly I try not to use the word moderate to describe any member of Congress. I guess there may be like a couple you could say. But for the most part, it's just like, how conservative are they, or how liberal / progressive are they?
So there's no dirty moderates left, huh? None?
Not that they're like a true centrist. I mean, I guess maybe. I mean, I think Manchin probably was the closest you had to that, and even he's headed for the exits.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing, to get granular about it, people have to remember too. So you have the rural-urban divide, but you also have, really the days, and going back now 50, 60, 70 years of the pre-culture war days. What you had was you have the civil rights and voting rights and fair housing bills getting through largely, not exclusively, but largely with Republican votes, not Democratic votes, because the Democrats had such a huge swath of the South. But you had like Nixon backing the ERA, for example, Dole backing the ERA, young Gerald Ford in Congress voting for civil rights, things that the Republicans would just vote for that were not demagogued. We didn't have cable news. We didn't have, you know what I mean? They might represent lily white districts in the Midwest, but they were the party of Lincoln, and they went ahead and voted for that. And actually, not until really Schlafly and the moral majority and stuff came along and became part of the Republican coalition, did all this and abortion, of course, did the culture war stuff come up. And I think that had a lot to do, it took time, right, with making the power grip that the Southern Democrats had on their seats in the old Confederacy become Republican, because there was no way that the nationalization of the brand Democrat wouldn't be tainted by identity, gay rights, and all this stuff, anti-gun, all the stuff that essentially took over, because Tip O'Neill's all politics is local, which used to be the adage, I still think holds power, but I think it's been overrun by the nationalization of our politics, don't you?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, our politics are very much nationalized, and you see it in the results, and that the presidential results are more highly correlated with the down ballot results than they've been at any time in recent history. Yeah. The abortion issue is an interesting one in that when Roe v. Wade was decided in 1973, and in the aftermath of that, you could have imagined a world in which the Republicans were the pro-abortion rights party and the Democrats were the anti-abortion rights party, in part because the Democratic Party was sort of so affiliated or so dependent on the support of Catholics, and of course the church has a strong anti-abortion abortion rights stance. Of course, you've got, even today you have prominent Democrats like Joe Biden and Nancy Pelosi who are Catholic, who have this sort of still have this tension between their sort of place within the church, I guess, and then also their place in politics. And of course, they are, in their political roles, are very much pro-choice, pro-abortion rights Democrats, and that does get Democrats into trouble sometimes with their own church going and what have you. But abortion became opposition to abortion rights sort of there was kind of this internal fight within the Republican Party. The 1980 Republican Convention and Reagan kind of established the Republicans more as the anti-abortion rights party, and then you also associated the Democrats with being sort of the party of the women's rights movement as well. And so those things got sorted out over time. But even now, I mean, I guess the parties are sorted on the abortion rights question too, but you did still have a lot of anti-abortion rights Democrats and a lot of pro-abortion rights Republicans, really for a long time, and still do to a certain extent, but not nearly to what the parties were much more jumbled up on that issue a few decades ago than they are now.
Yeah, I mean, to the point of the pro-choice woman, I mean, I think, there seem to be two groups here, at least at the presidential level, that could be proved decisive according to data that people I've spoken to and read. One is, of course, what will the Latino vote do? Meaning they're not going to go overwhelmingly for Trump, but Biden may win a smaller percentage of it because they may vote GOP. But pro-choice suburban women, the moderate Virginia probably won't be in play, but the suburbs of Northern Virginia, the suburbs of Philadelphia, Michigan, these are the people who were McCain-Romney voters. And then Roe was overturned and they went, are you fucking kidding me? We were voting for tax cuts and all this shit. We're not supposed to do this. This is supposed to be bullshit. And it happened. And you saw them in 2022 vote Democratic. The Lincoln Project has targeted them as sort of former, you might say, the old GOP voter, that mainline, mainstream, pro-choice, pro-gun control, largely college-educated woman voter. That could be Biden's strength if abortion is the centerpiece of the campaign.
Yeah, look, I mean, Democrats have done really well on the abortion issue in places where it's mattered since the Dobbs decision.
Yeah.
We just saw in Ohio, there was a, statewide ballot issue that did quite well. In that state, it was really kind of this like two-tiered fight in both August and November. And, the Democratic position got to 56, 57% in both of those elections. And the Republicans have lost all the statewide ballot issues about abortion rights in ranging from blue states like California to Vermont to red states like Montana and Kentucky. Now these are, different issues, different wording on them, et cetera. But the results have all been pretty similar and all in one direction. But of course, voters are not voting just on abortion rights. They're voting on all sorts of things. And, so it's not like every Republican who as anti-abortion rights was punished, far from it. But it is an important issue. And it's one where Democrats, frankly, have an advantage over Republicans.
Do you, getting down to I know you're looking, which is very important, the Senate map and the House map. I want to talk to you about that too. So this year, obviously the Democrats, I think overperformed, or at least the pollsters got it wrong about a red wave in 2022. However you want to look at it. This Senate map in 2024, though, is deeply inhospitable to Democrats, right? We just talked about Ohio, Sherrod Brown, who has been popular and survived in 2016, even as Trump carried the state by like 8 points. Tester in Montana, who's been holding on. And of course, Republicans will win that seat now that Manchin isn't running. I think they would have won it if he stayed in the race. Talk a little bit about the Senate map, where there might be other states the Democrats might have strengths or might not, and what that outlook is. I really want to break that down.
The Democrats have had several strong elections on this class of Senate seats. Really, 1994 was the last time Republicans had a good election on this map. So, 2000 Democrats gained seats, and actually they ended up having control of the Senate for part of Bush's first 2 years. Jim Jeffords left the Republican Party. 2006, Democrats flipped the Senate. 2012, they actually picked up a couple seats as Obama was reelected. And in 2018, the Democrats lost a little ground in the Senate, partially because they held a number of seats they really have no business holding, in like North Dakota and Missouri and Indiana. Rick Scott very narrowly flipped Florida that year too, which I think sort of was a signal of what would come in 2020 when Florida moved a little bit more toward the Republicans in that year. But for Tester and Brown up in 06, 12 and 18, they had decent environments. Mitt Romney carried Montana, but I think Montana was probably more open to voting Democratic down ballot back then than maybe it is now. But Tester still won in 2018 as well. But I think this is probably going to be the hardest kind of political environment for them, and it's also a time where, again, the results are more nationalized than they were in 2018 or 2012. So that's a challenge for Democrats right there. And then there are several other seats that Democrats are defending in states that Biden won, but were very close. So you got Arizona and, potentially Kirsten Sinema running in a three-way race. Democrat Ruben Gallego, Republican Kerry Lake, probably the nominees for there. And then we see if Sinema runs or not. Bob Casey in Pennsylvania, open seat in Michigan that Alyssa Slotkin, Democrat, is probably going to be the nominee for, and there's a crowded Republican primary. Nevada, very competitive state with Jackie Rosen. So there's a way in which things sort of get out of hand for Democrats if they're losing the presidential race too, and losing these states for at the presidential level. And all of the ones I mentioned were either were Trump states like Ohio and Montana, or were very close for president in 2020. Meanwhile, there really aren't that many credible Democratic targets. Florida with Rick Scott and Texas with Ted Cruz. Maybe one or both of those races pops. I think Democrats, particularly in Texas, have a decent candidate there in Colin Allred, former NFL player who's a member of the House, who was one of the kind of star Democratic candidates in flipping the House in 2018. Maybe something good happens there for Democrats, but those are two states you expect to vote Republican at both the Senate and presidential level. And then the rest of the states, the Republicans are defending are generally pretty solid red states.
Yeah. And in the House, we're obviously, Santos is out, but as I understood it and watched it 2 years ago, or a year and a half ago, the red parts of the 2022 kind of wave that was really just sort of like a little rivulet, really. We're up in New York and other sort of blue areas, which sort of gave the Republicans a narrow House win. Now it's very, very tight now. And I would think with a lot of these Republicans up in Biden-leaning districts, the Democrats just mathematically will probably flip the House. Am I reading this correctly, or is it hard to say?
I think it's hard to say. There is still some redistricting fights to get finished up. In New York State, Democrats tried to gerrymander it last time. The state court stepped in and prevented them from doing that. The Democrats may ultimately, through other court action, get another bite at the apple there. North Carolina went from having a court-imposed map to one that's a Republican gerrymander, so that the Republicans are going to pick up at least 3 extra seats in North Carolina. The Democrats they're probably going to pick up a seat in Alabama, maybe Louisiana too, based on the Allen versus Milligan decision from this summer from the Supreme Court, which basically has allowed Democrats to pursue the creation of majority-minority seats in a few places. So there's still some moving pieces, but ultimately, I think where you look is that there are a number of Biden-won districts held by Republicans in both California and New York, and those are going to be the big targets for Democrats.
Yeah. Do you see North Carolina, because people are eyeing that in the presidential election? Nevada, and I say this in relation to Nevada since 2008 has voted for Democrats in the presidential election, but each cycle it gets a little less blue. Even in 2022, even though Cortez Masto eked out, if ever, a small, very, very tiny win, the Republicans won back the state house. And Nevada will, I think, be very much up for grabs. But let's just assume Trump wins Nevada, which he has never won. He's lost it both times by a hair. Could North Carolina, even though Obama carried it back in 2008, I know that was kind of an outlier year, could North Carolina finally be the sort of purple state it seems like fighting to be in a presidential election?
I still think it's several ticks to the right of the nation. That's where it's sort of consistently sat for a long time now. And, it kind of seemed like maybe a decade ago that it would be like the next Virginia. But, certainly Raleigh-Durham and Charlotte have gotten a lot bluer over time, as a lot of big metro areas that used to be more competitive have done. But, there are some kind of growing kind of retiree sorts of places in Eastern North Carolina that are adding people and getting redder. There are some kind of traditionally kind of blue dog Democratic areas in Southern North Carolina that have gotten more Republican over time. So there's this kind of continuing shift in that state. And it's sort of, the changes have kind of canceled out to make it just a little bit right of center and consistently so. So, I think if the Democrats are winning North Carolina, it's probably not that close of a presidential election, because I'd expect that states like Nevada and Pennsylvania and Arizona and Wisconsin, Georgia would be more competitive than it. The interesting thing is that while it seemed like maybe, Virginia would realign and North Carolina would, and then maybe Georgia would be after that. Georgia kind of jumped ahead of the line. And part of it is because Metro Atlanta is so highly populated and growing so fast and getting so blue that it has, and also the Republicans were kind of capped out in a lot of the rest of the rural parts of the state. Georgia moved past North Carolina in kind of the realignment pecking order or whatever. And it's not clear that North Carolina is ever going to get there. But I think Georgia probably will get bluer over time, or rather maybe less red or less purple. Although that's still a heavy lift for Biden. A lot of the news reporting suggests that that maybe of all the Biden won states, that Georgia's might be the least likely to vote for Biden. I don't know if I necessarily feel that way, but there's a flavor of that in the reporting.
Yeah. And of course, Nevada, if you have to sort of basically carry Vegas and I guess Reno, because it's a very sparsely populated state in between, isn't that right? And those 10
it's something like, I think 85% or so of the vote is just in those two places. And Nevada is like a city state. It's like Las Vegas just dominates, and Clark County is a Democratic county. It's where Las Vegas is, but the Democratic margin there is, it really needs to be double digits or close to double digits, and it sometimes dips under that, and so that the Republicans won the governorship there, in part because just the Clark County margin was just not quite as good. And you could sort of see, it seems like the governor there, Steve Sisolak, former governor, now Democrat, who was the only incumbent governor or senator to lose in 2022 of either party, which is kind of an interesting stat given how people generally are so negative about politics, but incumbents were not necessarily punished. But I think there was a COVID flavor to that, in that of course Vegas is so dependent on tourism, and a lot of people work blue collar jobs there that you can't go on Zoom to do. And so that was sort of a problem. So I think it was actually kind of impressive that Cortez Masto hung on in that state. But Nevada, if in fact there is a growing kind of like multiracial realignment toward Republicans, Nevada is the kind of place where you might see it, just because it is kind of a working class state, like Georgia and Arizona with Metro Phoenix and Metro Atlanta, those are kind of more like white collar, kind of high end suburbs kinds of places. I could see a world 10 years from now where Georgia and Arizona are more Democratic than Nevada is.
Right. Yeah, no, it's interesting. And speaking of the sort of granddaddy of prizes, we're back to the Jimmy Carter in '76. Not only did he win the Confederacy, I guess this includes it, but he carried Texas. He's the last Democrat to carry Texas in a national election. And we just talked about Colin Allred, who I do agree with you is a formidable candidate, House member looking to unseat Ted Cruz. Beto had no such luck. No one seems to be able to kind of cross. I think it was like 52-48 or something. But in general, Trump's margin decreased in Texas in 2020 from 2016, but Biden did not come anywhere really near carrying it. Is that right? So
yeah, it was like a 5.5 point margin.
Yeah,
and so Romney,
that's big.
Yeah, Romney had carried Texas, I think, by like 16 or so.
Yeah.
So that's it's like a 10-point shift, and there's probably more room to grow for Democrats in the suburbs in those places, because you still have like some of the suburban counties around Austin, around Houston, the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. Those are still places that are, some of the most Republican-leaning big suburban counties in the whole country.
Right.
Like there's I think there's a county, Montgomery, which is north of Houston's Harris County, that is still like a 70% plus Republican county. And you look at it by the demographics and like the racial numbers and the college education numbers, you think, oh, this place shouldn't be as red as it is, but it just is. And it's, it just shows that, conservative, or Texas is still, kind of conservative leaning. If you had the same demographics of place in California, it probably would be a much more Democratic place, but there are still sort of differences between the two places. And so it's possible that Texas could end up being like North Carolina, in that Democrats get closer and closer there, but they can't quite get over the hump. And there also are places in Texas that where Democrats are losing ground, like South Texas. A lot of places near the border there used to be much more reliably Democratic than they are now. And that was one of the big shifts in 2020 is that you saw these huge swings toward Republicans and Trump in those places. Again, if you're looking at just the population centers, so much of the population in Texas is within the, I guess you'd call it, the sort of triangle, Dallas, Austin, Houston, and there aren't that many people who live in South Texas relative to this gigantic state. So if you see the Democrats, this sort of realignment continuing to happen in those big suburban places, the Democrats could afford to lose more votes in South Texas because there might be way more to gain in the more populated places. But I still think there's a ways to go for Democrats in Texas. And so, but it's important for the party to really try to contest the state and build an infrastructure there. Because, if you look at sort of the longer term trajectory of the Senate, let's say if Tester and Brown lose this year, that would put the Republicans at least 52 Senate seats. And that's assuming that nothing else flips. Right. It might be that those seats in Montana and Ohio are gone for a generation, maybe.
Yeah.
So where do they go then? And like the Sun Belt's where they got to go. And so they got to find a way to get a seat back in Florida or in Texas, or, break ground in Texas or break ground in North Carolina. They've already got both seats in Arizona. They've already got both seats in Georgia. So they have made some inroads there, but they have to make more inroads in that part of the country, given some of their struggles in other places.
Yeah. And, just to finish off here, I want to finish off with my home state. As I mentioned, I worked for Bob Graham. Bob Graham was a 2-term governor, 3-term senator. Florida had Lawton Chiles and it had all this. And yes, it is a Confederate state. It was the third state to secede. It didn't make the cotton that they needed. It was more like a meat factory or something like back in the day. So that's what they produced. But it has always been this kind of like Dixiecrat teetering on maybe red state, even growing up. Carter carried it in 76, but not until Bill Clinton in 96. If you remember, he didn't even win it in 92. Then astonishingly, Obama carried it twice. Is Florida, when I talk to, and I'm an independent, but when I speak to my old Democratic friends in Florida, it's depression. They just say, Florida's a red state, it's gone, blah, blah, blah. Well, I don't know. What do you think?
I think you could argue that if Bob Graham's daughter, Gwen Graham, had been the gubernatorial nominee in 2018, she might be in her second term right now.
She would have beat DeSantis for sure.
Because it was so close in 2018, and
it was
Andrew Gillum
in 2018, and
Andrew Gillum had some problems, and actually had many more problems after the fact in that election. But Gwen Graham came from that sort of obviously being Bob Graham's daughter, that sort of kind of more, I don't know, kind of moderate Southernish Democratic tradition. Yeah. What the story in Florida has been is that if you look at the places that are really growing, of course, Florida is a very fast growing state. It and Texas are, mega states that continue to grow. Texas added 2 electoral votes / House seats in the 2020 census. Florida added only 1. It's kind of a surprise. People thought it would end up being 2, but if you look at where the places are growing, it's it's not necessarily, South Florida or Tampa, St. Pete. It's like a lot of the retirement areas, some of the counties that are sort of north of Miami or, south of Tampa, St. Petersburg. A lot of those places are growing fast and getting redder, in part because I think they're attracting, conservative retirees from the Midwest and other places. Whereas like if you look at Texas, a lot of the fastest growing counties are red places that are not getting redder. They're sort of, they're getting more competitive over time. So I actually kind of think if you look at these demographics 10, 20 years from now than Florida is. That's how I sort of interpret it.
Right. All right. Well, before you go, I know you're in the data business.
I think something happened with the connection.
I'm there. Can you hear me? I'm here. Hello?
I can hear you fine. Yeah, both of our videos kind of gave the little spinning wheel as I was finishing up my answers. So I don't know if we lost something.
You want to just repeat with the last part of what you said? Oh, no, wait. You froze for a moment. Go ahead. Repeat it anyway. We can use it. To the extent you remember.
If you look at the places that are growing in Florida, a lot of them are kind of retiree heavy places and places that crucially, maybe went from supporting Obama in 2012 to supporting Trump in 2016 or 2020, basically growing places that are getting redder. If you look at Texas, a lot of the growing places are very Republican, but getting a little bit more competitive over time. And so you could, if you extrapolate that out, and it's probably dangerous to do that, these things can change and shift over time, but it may be that Texas is ultimately the more competitive state in the longer term than Florida is. Even though I would classify them both in sort of the same category right now as sort of Republican leaning, or, kind of somewhat competitive states that are clearly Republican leaning.
Right. All right. Well, on that note, I really appreciate your insight, and we want you to come back as the election season progresses here, and we have more data to work with, and give us more of your insights, your crystal ball. All right, if you would. I really appreciate it. Kyle Kondik, managing editor over at the Sabato UVA Center for Politics. Indispensable, folks. Kyle, where can people find you on Twitter and elsewhere so they can follow you?
Yeah, I'm at K Kondik on X or Twitter or what have you. And if people are interested in this, this kind of heavy elections material, sign up for our Crystal Ball newsletter. We come out generally twice a week, usually Wednesdays and Thursdays. centerforpolitics.org/crystal ball, or just Google crystal ball. There'll probably be like an eBay ad for like an actual crystal ball thing. You just scroll down, you'll find us. But yeah, thanks for having me on. I enjoyed our chat.
Absolutely. We'll all be peering into your crystal ball from now into 2024 and beyond. We'll list those in the description as well for you, Kyle. So anyway, thank you for your insight. As I said again, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you.